Hi, guys, and welcome to episode 1 of the Book Nook. I'm so excited. So let's get into it. We have a lot to talk about, and I'm very, very excited. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bella, and I am from Lamppost Studios. And if you have not checked out my channel, you definitely want to go do that because I have a lot of really neat content on there. If you have any video suggestions, definitely comment below and I will see what I can do. Alrighty, so today we're going to be discussing book 9.5, Unraveled of Keeper of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. Oh my goodness. This book was crazy. I don't even know what to say. So there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about, and I'm really, really excited. But first, before we get into it, before we get into analyzing and discussing the plot and the characters and all these exciting events that take place in this book, I have a slight spoiler alert. So if you have not read book 9.5 of Keeper of the Lost Cities yet, and you do not want any of it spoiled, then you probably want to come back and listen to this episode after you've read the book. But if you don't mind spoilers, then alright, you're going to get all of them today because we're going to be talking about like everything that's happened in this book. Alrighty, so let's get into it. Just leave a comment below on any of your thoughts on this episode and subscribe for more episodes because next week we're going to be discussing the first book of the Inheritance Cycle, Aragon, by Christopher Paolini. I love these books so much and I'm really excited to talk about those. But today we're talking about book 9.5 of Keeper of the Lost City, so let's dive into this. Alrighty, so just a little bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about Keith's abilities, because I feel like that's a really big part of this book, and just how he copes with them, and how he learns how to control them, and just some of these new revelations that we get about his abilities. Also, the dynamic between Keith and Alvar, and even Lord Cassius, because I feel like we get a glimpse of his other side, the other side of his personality, and I thought that's pretty interesting, so I really wanted to talk about just character dynamics and that sort of thing. Also, we have a very strange encounter towards the end of this book that I was not expecting, concerning the Ethan Eleanor mystery. If you remember anything about that, I think it was in some of the last few Keeper books. We discovered something about these humans that Gisela was contacting, and so Keith figures out a little bit more about that mystery here in this book. And then I have a little bonus for you guys at the end that I'm really excited about. So if you listen to the entire episode, you will get to hear some really fun, juicy stuff at the end. So definitely stick around. Alrighty, but let's dive into it. So let's talk through the plot first, just discussing the characters and their development a little bit as we go, and some of these things that I mentioned, different story elements and tropes, things that I did or didn't like, initial reactions about plot twists, and discussing some of the implications of some of the things that happened here. So, the plot. Honestly, this book didn't really have much of a plot, in my opinion. I feel like it focused a lot more on Keith and his inner conflict, so it felt like a very character-driven narrative, which in some ways made it a little bit boring, if I'm being honest. So why did Keith run away in the first place? Well, if you remember from book 8.5, what's it called, Unlocked, we see that there are 3 main reasons that Keith wanted to leave the Lost Cities. Number 1, because he wanted to get away to protect his friends and his family from these new strange abilities that he has no idea what they are or anything about them. Number 2, to figure out more about these abilities, how to control them, and what to do with them, I guess. And then number 3 is I feel like he really wanted to figure out more about the Ethan Eleanor mystery because he still blamed himself for their deaths. So I think that was a big part of him wanting to leave the chance to figure out a little bit more about something, about this thing. So the plot was really just a bunch of random events of Keith traveling around, trying to figure out what to do half the time. And it definitely dragged a little bit, I will say, because it's just Keith's in this one country, and now he's in another country, and he went and ate some food, and it was just like, okay, when's it gonna get interesting? So that was a little unfortunate, just how it dragged a little bit there. But anyway, if I'm being entirely honest, and I know this might not be a super popular opinion, but I don't really think the entire book was entirely necessary. But I don't know how I would have done it if I was in Shannon's position, so I'm not going to judge. But I do feel like it could have been probably a lot shorter than it was. But yeah. Now, there were some neat things to see. How Keith had mentioned several things in Book 9 that we get to see happen in real time in Book 9.5. And we get the answer to a few questions, and even more questions sometimes. In some cases, we don't always get answers. We just get more questions, and it's like, oh my goodness, when is this going to stop? When are we going to just figure everything out finally? But I think in some ways that was kind of cool to see. Now, I do think it was really important to know some of the things that Keith was thinking and that he experienced, but not everything was completely necessary, I think, because, he mentioned some things to Sophie, and we're kind of like, I kind of want to know a little bit more about that, but we get to see it happen in real time here. So anyway, moving on. Yeah, I feel like the book really started getting interesting when Keith discovered his dad's cabin. Now that was interesting, when he found that painting of himself in the room, and he was like, oh my goodness, of all places, I ended up in my dad's cabin. And it was crazy because it's like, oh, Lord Cassius has a cabin in the human world. Okay, this is new. And it's not really that surprising, though, because that's just Lord Cassius. He always has these weird sides of his personality that we're just slowly uncovering throughout each of the books. So that was interesting. But that's honestly where I feel like the book really started getting interesting, because we see this maybe a lighter side of Lord Cassius. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but we see this completely different side to Lord Cassius's personality. Like his true self, more of his true self, because I feel like Lord Cassius is the kind of person where he has this personality, but he's afraid of it. Like, he's almost afraid of himself, and he doesn't want other people to know about who he truly is. He likes to put on this, like, facade, and he likes to pretend that he's this dark, cold person, when in reality we know he's actually a lot like Keith through little hints that we see, or like when Sophie goes inside of Lord Cassius's head. But this is a side of Lord Cassius that we see where he's just like, it's his artistic side, more of an artistic side, maybe even a little bit sentimental. And he tries to hide it behind this cold demeanor and in these other houses that he has scattered throughout the world that we don't even know about. And it is very interesting because he is a lot like Keith. He's a lot like Keith, where he likes to hide himself, and he just doesn't want to admit that he's like his son. He sees himself as, his pride puts him way higher than Keith. He's like, oh yeah, Keith is just some out of control son. Is he my son? No, he's not my son. He's definitely not my son. But that's like, that's how he acts. And he doesn't want to admit that he's anywhere near Keith. He doesn't want to admit he's anywhere close to Keith in his personality whatsoever. But the interesting thing to note is that both Lord Cassius and Keith resist sympathy. They both resist sympathy. And I just thought that was an interesting thing to note, that in that way they both are like, they don't like it when anyone shows any sort of compassion or sympathy at all towards them. And that was just something interesting I wanted to know. But let's talk about the dynamic a little bit more between Lord Cassius and Keith. I didn't really know what to think about Lord Cassius giving Keith advice about living in the human world when Keith finally makes up his mind that he's going to go talk to he wants to try and sneak into his dad's house and get his stuff. He wasn't planning on meeting his dad, but he did. And it was really weird seeing Lord Cassius give advice to Keith. And he seemed, I almost want to say he seemed reluctant, but I'm not sure if that's the right word. Anyway, Lord Cassius is just a weird character. He's supposed to be good, which is the interesting thing. Like, he says he's good, he says he's on the right side, but then we see the way that he's treated Keith his entire life. And you're thinking, well, he's not a good person exactly, but he said at least he's not on the bad side. At least he's not on Keith's mom's side. And just the weird thing about his character is he does these weird, sketchy things, and he's very unapologetic towards Keith. He does not apologize for anything or for how he's treated Keith all these years, which makes you not like him, but then you kind of think at the same time, maybe I should like him because he's supposed to be good, but I don't know. It's just one of those really weird things. And, I believe that he does want to truly stop his wife, but I do think he still loves her in some ways, which makes him a sad character, one of those sad, broken down characters where he's conflicted with himself and with his life. And it just, ironically, it makes you sympathize for him. You feel compassion for him, just like you do with Keith. And I feel like in a way you can kind of trust Lord Cassius to a certain degree, but then he'll turn around and do something where then you're not sure anymore at that point. And honestly, I think Keith is afraid of his father. He doesn't really admit it, but you can see it in his actions. You can see how Keith is genuinely afraid of his father. And I almost think his father's afraid of him, too, if you really look at it. Lord Cassius sees in Keith himself how he was when maybe he was younger. And Keith sees in his father who he could become if he's not careful. And I think that scares both of them. And it turns it into anger deep down in both of them. So anger is kind of what anger or jealousy or fear, all of those things kind of drive them to do the certain actions that they do. Lord Cassius trying to hide all this side, the true side of himself, and Keith also doing the same thing, but in a different way, where he jokes and he's like funny, whereas his dad is just cold and dark and just not very nice at all. Yeah, and it's just a very, very interesting thing there, which in a way, honestly, it reminds me a lot of, from Harry Potter, a Draco Malfoy and Lucius Malfoy. I feel like it's, in a way, it is kind of similar to the situation there. Lord Cassius just reminds me so much of Lucius Malfoy. In fact, I actually imagine Lord Cassius to look like Lucius Malfoy. I don't know why. It's just a thing that, yeah. Anyway, but, yeah, and so it was interesting to see how Keith he wanted the advice his father was giving him, but he kind of resents him for it. I think they're both reluctant to help each other. Both Keith and his dad are doing what they need to do, but they're both reluctant about it. But I almost wonder, is this foreshadowing to later events of reconciliation? Because I'm always waiting. I feel like all of us are kind of waiting for, like, when is Lord Cassius going to say he's sorry? When is he going to make up with Keith? And I almost wonder if this is a little bit of maybe foreshadowing to this. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but we'll see. But real quick, before we move on, Keith's full name, Keith Erwin Sensen. For so long, we wanted to know Keith's middle name, and we finally have it, and the initials are literally KIS. I thought that was very funny. Yeah, but anyway, after Keith leaves his dad's house, we see some other things that happen. Keith's just traveling around again. He just has more advice on this time. He has more things to help him. Anyway, from this point on, I really felt like a lot of the book passed. It kind of went by very passively. It felt almost as if it was in a dream, which I almost wonder if it if that was on purpose, because Keith did seem to be in a dream half the time. He didn't really even know what he was doing, and his abilities were distracting him all the time, and just all these overwhelming emotions that kept hitting him. And I will say that was the part that was kind of boring to me personally. I'm like, okay, I've already seen this. What happens next? And I almost wish parts of the story felt a little bit more present, like it was actually happening. But I feel like that would have slowed down the story a lot. So yeah, that's just my thought on that. But let's move on to more of the characters, because I don't think there's really much more to say concerning the plot. So there's several things that I want to talk about. Alvar, number 1. Number 2, Keith's abilities. Number 3, the Eleanor and Ethan situation. So let's talk about Keith's character first before we really dive into any of those, because I feel like that's kind of important. So we already talked about Lord Cassius a little bit, but let's really look at what is Keith doing? What is he feeling? What is he going through in this book? Well, it starts off really different. It starts off really different from any of the other Keeper books that we've read, where I feel like we have finally seen the genuine Keith. We've finally seen who Keith truly is when he's not trying to hide himself in front of his friends. And we've seen glimpses of that when he hangs out with Sophie. But I feel like this is where we see the raw, plain Keith. This is Keith. This is the real Keith, the broken Keith. And it's really dark and grim. And Keith is broken, and in a lot of ways, and it's just really sad to see that. And you can see all these fears and insecurities about himself that just come out in his actions and his thoughts, because we could hear a lot of his thoughts in this book. And he's all by himself in this book for the most part. He doesn't have to hide a lot of the times, and so we just get to see it. We get to really see him for the first time, I think, in some ways. But it was almost like meeting a new character too. So yeah, that was very, very interesting to see this whole new change to the Keeper books. But I think that also really shows his true devotion to his friends, where he really cares about them and he doesn't want to put his burdens on other people. Specifically on Sophie, because that's part of the reason why he fled, was to get away from his friends and his family to protect them. And I think that really shows how deeply he cares about other people. He's trying to hide his hurts so that other people don't hurt for him. He doesn't want to cause other people unnecessary pain. And now that he has these new abilities, that makes it a lot more difficult. Yeah, and we can see that he really looks up to Sophie. He really looks up to her, and obviously we know that he likes her at this point. He's in love with her, whatever. But he also admires her as a person too, and I think he finds Sophie's own struggles inspiring to him because he's going through things that are very, very similar. And he uses similar methods in this book to what Sophie herself uses to overcome a lot of her own hurts and struggles. And you know how Keith's always like, what would Foster do in this situation? And that's where we can see how it's just very strange just how similar he and Sophie are in a lot of ways, how they share a lot of the same struggles and brokenness. And another thought that just occurred to me was Sophie, throughout the entire Keeper books, she's lived her entire life in the human world, and then she shows up in the elf world, in the Lost Cities, and everything is new to her. And it's the same for Keith in this book, where Keith has lived his entire life in the elf cities, and now he shows up and he's living in the human world for a while. And so we see just such strong similarities between Keith and Sophie, and it's just very, very interesting and really fun to read in some ways, although the plot did drag it at times. It was still pretty interesting. Yeah, but let's talk a little bit more about Alvar. So Alvar showed up like towards the middle of the book, I think. And there's a lot of interesting dynamic between him and Keith. Keith stumbles upon Alvar in the library, and where Keith happens to be searching for information on Ethan and Eleanor. And once he finally catches up with Alvar, Alvar finally explains his story to Keith, telling him what happened since we last saw him. And I just thought it was just very strange that Lord Cassius, of all people, decided to help Alvar. And Alvar, who we know is clearly supposed to be evil, it just strikes me as very strange that Lord Cassius decided to help Alvar when everyone else is so opposed to Alvar and just all these terrible things that he's done. But the creepy thing is Alvar, I think, genuinely believes that what he's doing is right. Like, he believes he's doing the right thing, even if that means hurting people or abandoning his family. But what he believes is right is not right, which is what makes it creepy. And I almost wonder if that's what Lord Cassius sees in Alvar. He sees that he might do the same thing in the same position. I mean, think about it this way. Like, what if Sophie had to abandon everything and everyone that she loved for what she believed was right? She would probably do it, although we know it would be very hard for her, and I think it was the same thing for Alvar. He believed that whatever he was doing was right, even if it meant giving up his family and his friends and his life and, you know, going undercover for a bunch of years and whatever else he did. But I don't know if it's just me, but I still don't fully understand why Alvar joined the Neverseen, and I don't think we're really supposed to know quite yet. I understand a little bit of what he means of the Vacker legacy or whatever, where he wanted others to realize that the Vackers weren't completely perfect. And I do think a lot of the reason why he chose to join the Neverseen was part of this deep-rooted jealousy towards his brother. But I also think there's something a lot deeper that hasn't been revealed yet. And I'm really hoping that comes up in the last book, because I would really like to understand Alvar's motives behind this, because like I said, he clearly believes whatever he's doing is right. And I just want to know what drove him to that conclusion. Because clearly we see that Alden and Della seem to be really good parents. So it's like, why would Alvar just suddenly be like, I don't know. Do you see what I mean? This is just weird to me. And I really feel like there's something else there that we haven't seen yet. So definitely comment on your theories about this, because this is something that I feel like we could dive really deep into, but we don't really have that much information about this yet. So yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. But I think Alvar is honest to wanting to help Keith in this book. He just believes that Keith is on the wrong side. This creates a lot of conflicted emotions in the readers, but also Keith too at the same time, where we want to trust and like Alvar, but we can't put aside these decisions and choices that he's made, and Keith can't either, and that's why he chooses to not trust Alvar for a while. But that's kind of the part of the story that didn't really make much sense to me, where Alvar was talking about how he tried to start a new life after such traumatic events that happened to him. He almost died 3 times, and yet after he was healed in the human world, he went on trying to live a new life. Honestly, for me, at that point, I probably just would have killed myself or just let myself die. So I'm like, what on earth is making Alvar want to live another life after such traumatic stuff that he's been through? Which I think also kind of plays back into what drove him to join the Neverseen. And I feel like that could be connected somehow, but I don't know. That just was weird to me. Yeah, and honestly, I think it was wise of Keith to not trust Alvar too quickly, but then at the same time, I think that slowed the story down a little bit. And I think it was a smart move of Shannon's putting Alvar in the book to help bring the story along, because we know who Alvar is, and she doesn't have to build like an entire new character. And Alvar understands what Keith is going through, and the fact that Keith and Alvar are very similar in personality, which maybe that's why Lord Cassius decided to help Alvar. I don't know. But I think if Alvar wasn't so creepily passionate about whatever he was doing that he thought was right, I think Alvar would be a pretty good character. But I guess Alvar is kind of one of those like gray characters where you're never really sure whether he's truly good or evil, and the reader just feels constantly conflicted about him. I would also consider these gray characters, because you have like white characters who are obviously good and then black characters who are obviously bad, and then you have gray characters where you're never really sure. And I also like to call these betrayal characters, because it's always those characters where it's like you're pretty sure this one person is good until they're not. And that's where I think Alvar kind of fits into that category, where we still don't know whether we like him or not, and we still don't really know whether he's completely good or evil at this point. So yeah. But let's move on a little bit. So let's talk about Keith's abilities. So like we mentioned earlier, Keith wants to get away from the Lost Cities to figure out more about his abilities. So, and he meets Alvar while trying to solve this mystery and to figure out all of his abilities and all that kind of thing. But let's review what are the main like aspects of Keith's abilities so far. Well, as we learned in the last few books, Gisela has discovered an ancient power source that the elves have been trying to hide. It's the seventh element, which is a manifestation of the three prime sources and are somehow connected to the fifth and sixth elements, which are quintessence and shadow flux. And if you remember, those are the two substances that were used upon Keith so that he manifested these weird abilities. And Stellar Lune was this plan that Gisela created with 3 steps, as far as we know, or this formula that involves exposing oneself to these elements to reach their full potential. And so we know that after Keith woke up from having this weird procedure done on him, he discovers these new abilities. He has the sense of just overwhelming and heightened emotions, which I almost wonder, is that because Gisela wanted to numb him, like just how Vespera, she got to the point where her empathy almost doesn't even exist anymore at this point, where she's numb to everything around her. So I almost wonder if that was part of Gisela's plan, but I guess we won't know as of now. But also, Keith seems to be able to sense people's abilities through their touch or even trigger new abilities, and he can command and control people with his words. So I just thought that was important to review before we talk about some of these changes that Keith goes through in this book. Okay, so at the beginning of the book, like I said, when Keith is light looping to all these different places, we see how all these emotions are just hitting him constantly wherever he goes. And he quickly begins to learn that distracting himself, like putting a rock in his shoe, for example, or thinking about Sophie, helps him keep his mind off of these abilities. Yeah, and then when Keith gets to London, he encounters this guy who offers advice to him about distracting yourself from pain, and he says he visualizes a switch to flick it off. And so that seems to work with Sophie, as you might remember, when controlling her abilities, where she uses mental control to hone her abilities to her will, and creating that mental switch to flick it off whenever she wants. And something that I thought was quite interesting was that O'Reilly, who is also an empath, as you remember, explained this trick to Sophie, saying that it's a thing that empaths will use. Keith is an empath, and this same trick works for him, which it's not surprising that it works, but I just found that an interesting connection there. And then this was something that it reminded me of how you remember, if you remember, Lord Cassius's theory. I can't remember what it is exactly. Something about like your emotions and your heart are like connected to your brain or something. I don't remember, but it's some sort of the heart of the matter. That's the book that he wrote. Yeah, just talking about this theory, and I almost wonder if this has to play in to what's going on with Keith's abilities. So that just was kind of a hunch that I had, like this is probably going to become something bigger later on. Yeah, and so from that point on, Keith's abilities don't seem to bother him anymore until he and Alvar return from Australia. And Keith touches Alvar's hand, and suddenly Alvar has his powers back. That was interesting. I almost thought it was kind of stupid because Keith was like, Alvar's been lying this whole time. He doesn't have abilities and like whatever. And I was like, no, Alvar has not been lying. Just stop. Yeah. Anyway, so I thought this was a pretty significant thing when Alvar mentioned the well that he remembers drawing the strength from to perform his abilities or whatever, or to vanish and all that stuff. And so, a side note here, I think Shannon does a great job describing all these abstract things, like going inside people's minds and all these barriers and nooks and all these energy reserves and feelings inside people. And I think that's really great. But anyway, so we figured out that Keith probably does trigger abilities. And this is when Keith finally has to start talking to Alvar now about his abilities, because he didn't want to at first because he doesn't trust Alvar. But he begins to realize that maybe Alvar does understand kind of what I'm going through and he can help me figure this out. And so Alvar finally convinces Keith to finish filling that well that Keith cracked open and basically complete his ability triggering. And so Keith attempts to fill it with his energy, and he has this moment of self-doubt that he's not good enough until he discovers this secret energy reserve deep inside of him. And he's afraid that this energy reserve is what makes him evil, because he thought he felt like this rage or something. I don't know. But I think from that point, me as a reader and Keith as well began to realize what embrace the change means. Like, even with all these scary implications of Keith's new abilities and whatever Gisela was trying to do by giving Keith these abilities, I honestly think the key to winning this whole thing is Keith is going to have to learn how to use his abilities. He needs to learn how to quit fighting them and embrace the change. And like Alvar tells him, it's who you decide to be that makes you you. And whether that secret reserve of energy that Keith found, and he thought it was just like built up rage or whatever, that's not what makes Keith evil. It's not what makes him good either. It doesn't make him one or the other. Keith has to choose what he's going to do with his abilities and what he's going to do with these secret energy reserves. And he does definitely have to be careful, though, because we've seen what the council did to Sophie out of fear. They restricted her powers for a while. And now that we can see what the council is capable of, Keith does definitely need to be careful when he returns back to the Lost Cities with these new abilities. But I really do think he just needs to learn how to use them, because it's just going to make things a lot better. Yeah, and I think he started to realize that. But to be honest, overall, I don't feel like we learned very many new things about Keith's abilities, other than the fact that we still don't know why he has them. But we may have a slightly better understanding of Gisela's intentions with what she was doing, and the fact that maybe she was trying to numb Keith, or maybe she's trying to use Keith to trigger other people's abilities, or I don't even know if she knew what Keith's abilities were going to be. But I think it was confirmed now that Keith does indeed trigger abilities. He doesn't just sense them, he can trigger them. Now let's move on to the Ethan and Eleanor mystery. I just kind of wanted to talk through this a little bit. So we saw that Keith kind of figured out that he is probably not directly involved with the murder at all, which I think gave him some closure about that. But he just goes around exploring the libraries in between, trying to figure out his abilities and Alvar and all that stuff. And he sees that Ethan was an astrophysicist, I think is how you say that. And I think that's interesting because it's related to stars. And if we remember that Stellar Lune is all about stars and just how the planets align and all that stuff. I can't remember all the details. But anyway, that made me wonder, did Gisela want him because he happened to know about stars? Is that why she was contacting him, because he knew something that she didn't? But then it's like, why Ethan, of all people? Why Ethan Benedict Wright II? You know, why can't it be any other astrophysicist? Which makes me think maybe he knew something that other people didn't. Maybe he was connected somehow to the elf world. And Gisela knew that and wanted to contact him because he knew something that she wanted. But then, you've read the book, Keith is literally attacked by Eleanor out of nowhere. And that was crazy because it was like, hold up, what? I thought she was dead, number one. Number two, why is she here and why is she tackling Keith? So it was interesting to hear Eleanor's side of the story, and we quickly discovered that the whole death thing wasn't actually real. Now, we do discover that her dad did end up dying, but most of, like, the whole grave thing, like, those weren't their actual graves. Like, none of that was real. And we quickly realized that it was because Ethan obviously wasn't telling Gisela what she wanted, and so she started coming after him, and so as a result of that, they needed to get out of there. They needed to pretend that they had never existed, that they died, and that no one's ever going to remember them again. And so when Eleanor finds Keith, she basically tells him, no one needs to know about this. This scene actually gave me a little bit of, like, Percy Jackson vibes. Eleanor reminds me a lot of Rachel Elizabeth Dare. But this whole scene just kind of reminded me a little bit of that, and I thought that was just a funny thing to note. But yeah, I think that kind of wrapped up that whole thing a little bit. I mean, there's not really much to talk about the whole thing, just the fact that they never actually died, and that was all a ruse to protect them from Gisela and the Neverseen. And it was also good for Keith to have a little bit of closure about this whole thing, because he still blamed himself for their deaths and all that. But I do think it poses a few more questions of what did Ethan know? What was it that made him stand out above every other astrophysicist out there? Yeah, so I don't know if we'll ever get any more information about what happened there in the last book, but we'll see. Anyway, yeah, I feel like that wraps it up for the discussion for the most part about book 9.5. And it was just, this book was neat in a lot of ways because we got to see a lot of things from Keith's perspective. We learned a little bit more about his abilities and some other things, and there was a little bit of humor in the book, which was enjoyable. But I feel like for the most part, the book was pretty unnecessary. A lot of that could have been told in a much shorter way without having to write an entire book about it. And also the fact that, like, there really wasn't much of a plot, so it wasn't that fun to read. It was just Keith just doing a bunch of random things, and it just dragged in a lot of parts, and I feel like it really could have picked up the pace a little bit for it to stay interesting. But I feel like a lot of the things in here were pretty interesting, or, like, important to the story for the most part. So if you are planning on reading book 9.5, if you haven't yet, it's probably a good idea just to understand a little bit more of Keith's experiences in the human world, or the Forbidden Cities. Yeah. Now, there was one last thing I wanted to mention before I move on to the bonus that I have for you guys. This was, like, really annoying to me, like, really, really random, so I'm sorry, but I'm gonna rant for just a second. But it was very annoying that there were, like, 2 mentions of same-sex marriage in this, and that was super unnecessary, in my opinion, and very annoying, because Shannon hasn't done this in any of the other books. And why is she doing it now? There is no reason to do it now, even if they are in the human world. Like, that doesn't... yeah. Super random, super unnecessary, and is really stupid because nobody cares. If I'm being honest, nobody cares whether some guy has a husband or not. Like, really? And then the fact that when Keith and Alvar actually talked about it, they were like... And I mean, like, I understand the conversation they were having, talking about how different the Lost Cities was from the human world, and the fact that they didn't have a matchmaking system, which we know is a really big part of the Lost Cities, and we know is also one of those fundamental things in the Lost Cities that probably needs to be changed. But the fact that they talked about the whole same-sex marriage thing and how like Keith was like, yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm like, really? Really, Shannon? You have to put that in there. Anyway, that's just my little rant there. But yeah. But then we get to see chapter 42 from Keith's perspective, and that was awesome. I'm going to be honest, that was my favorite part of the whole book, because I was like, yeah, this book is not my favorite, but I love the end of it. That made the book worth it, in my opinion. I can never get enough. Nobody can ever get enough of So Keith. So cute. It was awesome. It was just really fun to read that. So thank you, Shannon, for that. Now, here's the bonus thing before we go. I know I've been kind of rambling a lot, but I wanted to talk about theories for book 10. What does book 9.5 mean for book 10? These are just some questions that I have to get you thinking. And is book 10 going to be the final book? Is it actually going to be the final book? What things should we expect for this book? What things need to be resolved in this? And how does the big final showdown play out? What big revelations will we see next? Who is Alyson? And how does she play into the story? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. How are the Lost Cities changed after the big climax? That's one of my biggest questions. What does life look like for Sophie and her friends after everything is resolved? So here's some things that we know that we can expect in this. We know that there's going to be a big showdown eventually. We know the book will probably open up in Alyson, where we get to figure out more about her and how she plays into the story. Is she good or is she evil? How is she going to play in there? Will she help Sophie and her friends, or will she be against them? I'm also hoping we get a lot more info on Keith's abilities, and maybe have Gisela herself explain why she did all these things to Keith exactly, and we can get the full story on that and the whole Stellar Loon thing. That would be great. And yeah, I have a feeling that, like I mentioned earlier, I feel like Keith's abilities are going to play a lot into this, and maybe even Sophie and some of her other friends will develop new abilities if Stellar Loon turns out to be like a good thing and it works on everybody else too. And I almost wonder, like, will that be the big weapon that they'll use to defeat like the bad guys and the Neverseen and all that stuff? We also know that Vesper died at the end of the last book, so we have one less enemy to deal with here. But what's going to happen to the rest of the Neverseen? How are they going to play into all of this, and what side are they going to choose in the end? Yeah, also something else that I was kind of thinking about was Ro hasn't shown up yet. She left because she was chasing after these rebel ogres, and she was going to go figure out what the deal was with that, but she still hasn't shown up yet, so something may have happened there, which I wonder if that's going to play a big part in book 10. Does Ro rally the ogres to help the elves in a final showdown thing? Like, that'd be pretty cool. But I guess we'll have to see what happens with that. But we all know there's going to be some sort of big showdown, but what is that going to look like? I am personally hoping it's going to be a big full-out war, but is that really what it's going to take for the Neverseen to surrender and for the Lost Cities to really see these fundamental issues and make them change? I think the council at this point is really aware of a lot of these issues, but I don't know if they're still fully on the Black Swan's side. I don't know if they're fully on the side that they need to be yet, and I feel like there needs to be some sort of outside force, so to speak, that like pushes them to realize, maybe like it's the final climax that makes them realize what they need to change, which I'm assuming is probably going to happen. But honestly, guys, if it's not like some full-out war, I'm going to be really mad, because I feel like the tension has been building for so long. I mean, this is over a span of like, I don't even know how many books. Because there's 9 books technically, and then there's the other 2. So that's like 11 books. Like the tension has been building over 11 books, guys. That's crazy. Yeah. So I really hope it's going to be some full-out works. Otherwise, I'm going to be very mad. Yeah, I almost wonder if a lot of like the council secrets and stuff are also going to play a big part in that as well. If they're going to open up these secrets, and that's and maybe we'll figure out more about this Elyson character and if she plays into that somehow. But I'm also wondering, do other races get involved here? Because, I mean, obviously, like, throughout each of the books, the Never Seen seem to be targeting each of the different races, and I almost wonder if they're all going to unite together and go against the Never Seen. Who is going to be involved here? Are the humans going to get involved? That would be very, very, very interesting. And what side are the council members really going to take, and what's going to happen with them? But here's another question that I think has really been boiling in the back of a lot of our minds. Does Gisela die? Like, they talk about killing her, but I honestly can't see Keith actually killing her or anyone else actually killing her. I'm kind of thinking it almost might be some sort of accident of some sort, or like someone will betray her and then Never Seen and like stab her in the back, like literally. But I think, yeah, I still think Keith loves his mom to a degree, and I can't imagine him actually going to the point of killing her. That's just my thought on that, but I don't know. We'll see. Because I kind of doubt Gisela would have some sort of redemption point, honestly, but I don't know. We'll have to see. Shannon's probably going to surprise us with something like really big that none of us are going to see coming. But I think one of my biggest questions that I want to talk about is, do we get to see their new lives after the big showdown, after the big climax? Or will it end on another cliffhanger for us to imagine what their lives are going to be like? Or maybe it's going to be hints at big changes that are going to be made so that we have an idea of what their new lives would be like. Or do we get to see it in real time? That I'm really hoping for, but I guess we'll have to see. But how do the elves cope with the humans after this? Because we know that they've talked about this where it's like the lost cities are a thing because the humans have taken over literally the rest of the world. So how are they going to cope with that problem there? I'm almost thinking there might be some sort of like, they almost like take all the races, so like the ogres and the goblins and like the gnomes and whatever. I don't even remember whatever all the races in Keeper of the Lost Cities are. I'm almost thinking all of them are going to come together and form like a united like kingdom sort of thing. I think that'd be really cool, and I think in a lot of ways that would work out really well. And I don't know if the humans are going to get involved in that somehow, though that would be a big game changer if they did. But that's just a crazy theory I'm throwing out there. So I definitely want to hear you guys' thoughts on this, because there's a lot we could talk about here. But before we wrap this up, there's a few more things I want to talk about here. Specifically, like, what about Sophie's family? Because we know that she sees them a little bit throughout the books, but does she actually get, like, united with them, or like how does that work? I wonder if they'll show up again. What about Alvar? Does Alvar stay in the human world? Does he die? Does he get reconciled with his family? Like how does that turn out? How will that turn out? Or will he die believing that he's still right? That would be kind of sad. But let's talk about a few more personal things. How is this going to personally affect our characters? What about the collective in the Black Swan? Mr. Forkel said that he always, I can't remember which book this is in. I think it's in book, like the book Never Seen, where he mentions to Sophie and her friends that he said, I'm just paraphrasing here because I can't remember exactly what he said, but you might remember what I'm talking about, where he goes, there always needs to be rebellions out there. Like there's always going to be something that we need to rebel against or whatever. And so he was talking about Sophie and her friends becoming the next collective, and Sophie was like, what? So I almost wonder, will the Black Swan continue to be a thing, or are they going to work hand in hand with the council? Like, are they going to like completely redo their government system? Like, how is that going to work out? So that's something very interesting to think about. But one thing that I would really like to see is, do we get to figure out the other collectives' identities? Because I think we know most of their identities at this point, but I think maybe it's Blur. I think it's Blur is one of them that we don't remember, like, we don't actually know who he is at this point, but I do remember a scene where Sophie is on, I can't even remember what book this is in, but they're riding on Lady Cadence's, like, boat thing, and there's a wave that splashes up, and Blur was with them, and the wave splashed over him, and for a second Sophie could see the outline of him, and she said that he looked kind of familiar. So I almost wonder if we get to figure out his identity and the other collective's identities, or even Mr. Forkle, like if he has any more identities. That would be interesting to see. And do they happen to play a significant role in the story? Do we already know the characters that they are? Like, do we know who the collective actually is? But what about Keith? How will his powers and his abilities affect his life later on? Does he ever reconcile with his dad? Like I was talking about earlier, and do they ever apologize to each other? Does that even change at all? Like, who will Keith end up living with? If he doesn't make up with his dad, who is he going to live with? Until he gets married or whatever, because I'm assuming he's going to marry Sophie, which I really hope that happens. Well, that reminds me, what about the bodyguards? Like, what's going to happen to them? Will they need the bodyguards anymore? Will they willingly live with them? But if there's going to be, like, if they're all going to be living together in, like, a city, maybe they get to see each other all the time. So, I don't know. But what about the Vackers? How is that going to turn out? Because Fitz, for instance, like, we know he has a I like Fitz, okay? Like, I know some of you, like, full hardcore Keith fans are like, what? You can't like Keith and Fitz. You can't like them both. But I do. I'm sorry. But, yeah, but does Fitz, like, he has some anger issues, though. Like, although I like Fitz, he does have anger issues. But does he overcome his anger towards Alvar? Does he ever overcome that in the end? What if Fitz is evil? What if he turns out evil? That would be really interesting. Yeah, I don't know. But, I'm also kind of wondering who Fitz is going to end up with. Like, if he even gets married. Like, how is that going to happen? I was almost thinking my two ideas were Lynn or Morella, or even Rainey. That would be very interesting, but I have no idea. It'll just be fun to see who all gets together in the end. But what about the character of Rainey? Like, I feel like she has a lot of potential there. I feel like there's still more we can learn about her, and she might play significantly into the story later on, because I feel like she could change a lot of the story and the direction of how that goes. But I guess that's one of those other things we'll just have to see. But what about Sophie? Sophie's our main character. And how is all of this going to affect her personally? Because she was literally created with the idea in mind that she was going to change everything. And she has done a lot. But does she ever step up to become a leader or something? Does she ever rise up and just, like, is she going to be the head of a new government? Is she going to be, like, a king, or, I mean, queen? Or, like, what is she going to do? Is she going to be a leader, or is she going to just, I don't even know. I don't know. But what challenges is she going to have to face personally? And I'm really just wondering how her and Keith's relationship is going to go, and how things will play out with that. I'm really excited to see this romance play out, because Shanna just kind of dropped the bomb at the end of that book, and then it was kind of like, what's gonna happen? So are they gonna start dating, or, like, how are their friends gonna react to this? Because I don't think anybody knows about it at this point. And if we do get to see a glimpse into their later life, do they end up getting married? What's gonna happen there? Yeah, so I'm just, like, majorly speculating right now. But yeah, but I think one of the hottest topics right now about theories about book 10 is, who is Sophie's dad? Who is Sophie's biological dad? Do we know who he is already? And I'm really hoping that we don't, in a way, because that would be really sad if it turns out to be someone like Tiergan, because I love him, and that would, like, totally destroy a bunch of things if he ends up being Sophie's dad. That was one of my biggest, like, that was one of my biggest things. And I was seriously thinking it could have been, oh my goodness, the counselor, I cannot think of his name. The, like, mean counselor that she thought was her dad, sorry. Wow. My mind is going blank. Anyway, I have no idea who her dad is. Yeah, but does Sophie ever resolve? Does she ever forgive O'Reilly? Does that dynamic between them ever change to the point where they're friendly with each other? Do we get to see the true story of how O'Reilly got involved in the Black Swan? Because I feel like there's some more to that we don't really know yet. Yeah, anyway, I feel like there's a lot of potential for book 10, and I really hope this is going to be the last book, because I know all of us are dying to figure out what happens. But I feel like this could possibly be the biggest Keeper book. Like, it could be like 900 pages or something, and that would be awesome. And I almost feel like that book would need that for a lot of these things we talked about. I feel like there would need to be a lot of pages for all this stuff to play out, but guess we'll have to see, guys. But yeah, there's a lot to dive in with conspiracies there, so definitely comment there about your thoughts on book 10. But I had so much fun doing this episode. I know I kind of rambled a lot here and there, but this was really fun being able to do this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And just a reminder, Aragon, book 1 of The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini is coming out on February 16th. So we're going to be analyzing that and talking through that, and that is going to be a lot of fun because I love those books so much. Yeah, so subscribe for more content and for more podcasts. I'm definitely open to suggestions and feedback, so if you have any kind of videos or anything like that you want to suggest, definitely leave a comment below. But yeah, follow me on my socials, and I hope you have a great day. Bye, guys!